Dear friends of the Major TV, welcome to this special In Conversation with David Whitwell. Today the episode is called Music as an Expression of Time. Hello, David.
Good evening. Time is something we all are aware of to some degree, but since you cannot see time, we have to create labels in order to make time function in our lives. For example, to speak of the rotation of the earth, we speak of this as a day. And to speak of the rotation of the earth around the sun, we speak of this as a year. But these kinds of labels are very limited. And for example, if you use those two definitions with regard to the planet of Mars, they don't work. You would discover that on Mars, a day is longer than a year. When it comes to our daily life, the use of our left hemisphere of our brain, that is to say, language and numbers, becomes very difficult in terms of time. Because to speak of language, for example, the sentence that I just now spoke is already past tense. And the future tense, of course, is not here yet. So the present tense is a very small split place in time between the past and the future. On the other hand, and same thing with numbers. On the other hand, the right hemisphere is quite different. It's the experience side of ourselves, and one might say it's the real us. On the right hemisphere, a very interesting phenomena occurs, which in effect stops time. And on the right hemisphere, when we listen to a composition, we feel like we're hearing the whole composition in the present tense. It reduces everything to this moment of the present tense. Could be a long symphony, but we still hear it as one object in the present tense. And this, of course, makes music possible because movement is a fundamental part of not only time, but of music itself. Movement is what allows music to exist as we know it. And music movement also is closely tied to feelings. For example, the first use of the word movement, which was in France in the early 17th century, the first use of that word did not refer to first movement and second movement, but to emotions, first emotion, second emotion. And when I was living in Salzburg at one point, the woman who owned the house I lived in, she would go to a concert and she would come back and talk about, she heard a symphony. She'd talk about the first feeling and the second feeling. And I eventually realized she was talking about first movement and second movement. And of course, in English, we have the word motion, which we define the same as movement. Well, if you take the word motion and add one single letter to the front of it, the letter E, you get emotion, which is a testimonial to how close feeling is to movement. It's no surprise, therefore, that Baroque composers, 17th century composers, when they wanted to describe music, the movement in music, instead of using numbers or numbers representing time, they used words that meant feeling or were subjective. For example, Julius Polak's 2nd century, in describing two kinds of dances, called them grave and gay. Arbo, in his famous treatise on dance, in talking about the three kinds of bas danse, used the words comfort, forlorn, or patience. And Johann Mattheson, in the 18th century, German composer, he actually defined movement as being something meaning spiritual. And he defined adagio as meaning distress, andante as meaning hope, and allegro as meaning comfort. The great crisis in the history of music comes in the late Middle Ages, when the idea is brought forward to writing music on paper. This creates a divorce between music for the ear, which had been previous history of music for millions of years, and now music for the eye. And written music, music for the eye, written music is frozen music. In written music, there is no time at all. And in written music, there's no feeling at all. In other words, when they invented music notation 1,000 years ago, they did not include one single symbol of any kind to represent feeling or emotions. And it's still true today. The way we write music today, there are no symbols for feeling. Well, music had become frozen, dead notes on paper. It was the performing musicians who saved music as we know it today. And they did this by finding ways to expand time itself. One way they did this was through rubato, which most of us are familiar with. Rubato is defined as stolen time. The famous singing teacher of the 17th century named Tosi, he wrote, "Any singer who does not know how to steal time in singing is destitute of the best taste and education." Another way in which performing musicians created expanded time and made it real as we know it, we call today placement. An example of this is if you have some music for maybe a singer or a flute player or something with accompaniment that ends a phrase in the middle of a measure. It could even include a retard, which also expands that measure. But after the cadence, the Johann Quantz, in a treatise of 1752, correctly pointed out that after the cadence, we need a certain amount of space, a certain amount of silence to allow the cadence to really fulfill its function as a cadence. And so then when you start the music again, that's where we use the word placement. And we mean to place the music when it starts again, where it feels right musically, psychologically, or emotionally, not where it is indicated in notation. You place it where it seems the correct place to start. Let me give you another example of this. There's a wonderful partita by Mozart in C minor known as Kerkel 384A. He wrote this piece of music just after he lost his job with the Archbishop of Salzburg. And he not only lost his job, but he was literally kicked out of the palace, kicked in the pants by the manager of the music of the Archbishop. Mozart, of course, was very highly offended by this and very angry. So this piece of music starts with very angry sounding. In fact, when you hear it performed, it almost feels like there have been 50 measures left out or something, because it doesn't start like a piece normally starts. It starts with this fast, intense, angry kind of music. Well, the second movement is quite different. The second movement in Andante has always seemed to me, the melody has always seemed to me to be domestic tranquility. It goes dee da dee da dee da dee dee da dee, very happy and calm sounding music. When you get to the development section, Mozart is going to do something that was very common with development sections in the classical period. And that's simply to take a theme and present it in several different keys. So Mozart starts out, dee, ra, dee, 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 dee. And then he just stops. It just hangs in the air. And he starts again in a different key. And it just stops again. It does this a third time. And obviously, his mind is somewhere else. He's completely distracted. And I've always wondered if maybe it was because he was thinking about the death of his first child, a little boy named Raimon, who died almost exactly a year before Mozart was writing this piece. In any case, his mind is somewhere else. When he gets to the recapitulation, he writes da capo, and then he realizes that's wrong. He doesn't want it to start at the beginning at bar 1. He wants it to start again at bar 9. So he creates a new symbol. Looks a little bit like a sparkler that you use in fireworks demonstrations. Makes a symbol of a thing that looks like a sparkler, and then makes another version of it on bar 9. The point is that even now that he's starting the recapitulation, his mind is still not on the music. His mind is still somewhere else. Well, these separate little incomplete statements are separated by 2 quarter note rests. And it's important to point out that when all the music stops, a quarter note rest has no definition at all. It cannot be defined unless it's part of music that has a tempo. So it's to perform this first incomplete statement and then rest 2 beats and do the next one would be quite wrong. This is where placement is so important. You have to wait until you feel it's the right time to continue. And another version of this we find in the cadences of this movement. In the exposition section, the closing section closes with 2 eighth notes. The music is now marked piano, but these 2 eighth notes are marked forte, and they have a vertical slash over the top, which is the loudest possible accent that Mozart knew how to write. And so we go da dee da dee 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 da dee, like the end. That's all. It seems so aggressive and so out of place that it seems like it's still the memory of the first movement, still the memory of his being kicked out of a job. Well, at the end of the movement, when the closing section comes back, And now the atmosphere is completely different. Now the listener has heard this deeply moving and strange emotional development section, and that changes the whole picture. And now it would be really wrong for Mozart to end the piece by going bump, bump. It would be like Mozart saying, I wasn't serious, it doesn't matter. Instead, he writes, instead of forte for those two notes, he writes pianissimo, which we know today means molto retard. And so now the piece ends da dee da dee, dee dee da da, dee dee. And this has the very important function of allowing the listener to release the emotions of this movement before the next movement starts. Another example of this, which is well known to conductors, comes in the great Grand Partita, a larger piece for wind instruments, in the Adagio, a very famous movement because it's very high quality. This movement ends with a melodic fragment played 3 times in a row. It sounds like this. Doesn't sound like an ending. And under the third statement, he writes pianissimo. For years, conductors thought that Mozart wanted the third one played very soft, and that would make it sound like an ending. And you can do that in rehearsal if you have good players, but it never works in performance, because in performance, the players are also caught up in the great deep emotions of this adagio, and it's a long movement. By the time you get to the end of the movement, the players are exhausted, and the last thing they want to think about is suddenly trying to play the last few notes 50% of the volume of the previous. And again, we now know that the pianissimo for this bar means molto retard. And now we have an ending that's very elegant and sounds like what Mozart would have done. And again, allows the listener to release his emotions before the next movement. So now we have the ending like this. And it sounds better the slower that you play it. Another idea that useful for expanding the music is the Eingong. This is a word actually created by Mozart. Eingong refers to a very brief improvisation, just a few notes or a couple of measures to connect two very dissimilar sections of music. So it's not an abrupt movement from one section to the next section. And this little improvisation is always played by whoever has the melody in the oncoming section. And of course, cadenzas are ways of expanding time, expanding movement. The Baroque cadenza always was just the last measure of a movement, and it was very short. The definition they gave at the time was, if you're a singer or a flute player or something, it's whatever you can do in one mouthful of air. In other words, something very short. The later classical period cadenzas, of course, are very long, lengthy. They're often 10 or 15% of the movement of the whole movement. Finally, with regard to expanded time, we have the concept of tempo. The speed at which music moves through time. And as was the case with the first use of dynamics in the 17th century, tempo was left to the player, not the composer. So we have, let me find my quotation here. Again, Johann Quantz, 1752, writes, here's an example of leaving it to the player. A composer named Bonicelli, 1642. He said, one must guide the beat in accordance with the feeling. And in a very famous quotation, often quoted quotation by Monteverdi in 1638, he was talking to a singer and he said, you must sing in the time of the heart, not in the time of the hand, referring, of course, to a conductor. And then we have the Italian words that we know today at the top of a composition, andante, allegro. These words were first used also in the beginning of the 17th century in Italy. And after several decades, composers in particular began to feel that these words were just too general. And so Quantz wrote in 1752, it's necessary to find the tempo in the actual content of the music and not from the Italian words at the top of the page. Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father, said the same thing. And he said, finding the tempo in the actual music will always identify the true quality of the musician. Well, finally, in terms of tempo, we have the metronome. Metronome comes again at the beginning of the 17th century, when it was a period, a European-wide a mechanical reinvention period. Everybody was trying to invent things. Ordinary people were trying to invent things for daily life. And a number of people were trying to invent something to help musicians keep time. And of course, the winner of this competition was a man named Melzel and his famous metronome, which we still use today. And it hasn't changed since he invented it. Metronome, Melzel, by the way, was a close friend of Beethoven. And after the death of Beethoven, Melzel immigrated to America and opened a music shop in Philadelphia. But the use of a metronome has always been controversial because a metronome gives a steady beat, which tends to lend a kind of sterility to music. Music isn't that constant all the performance isn't that constant all the time. And so the first important composer who actually used the metronome was Beethoven. And one day, a young composer comes up to Beethoven and says, Master, you must be so happy. Now you can write down the exact tempo of every movement. And Beethoven said, yes, that's helpful. But Beethoven said, the metronome number only applies for the first 2 or 3 measures. After that, feeling has its own tempo. And that's what we hear in performances. Performers feel free to slow things a little, speed things up, which the metronome does not allow. There's a very famous letter of Brahms, Johannes Brahms. He was invited to guest conduct one of his symphonies with the Meiningen Orchestra in Germany, which at that time was the best orchestra in Germany. And after the experience of conducting, he wrote to a friend and said that he was very disappointed because he said, I could never get the orchestra to speed up in places or to slow down in places, none of which, of course, appear on paper. But he was doing what musicians feel like doing. And that is not possible under the concept of a steady beat of a metronome. So by the end of Beethoven's life, he seems to have given up this use of the metronome. We have a very interesting letter from Franz Liszt, the greatest pianist of the 19th century, who, as a young man of 17 years of age, had the opportunity to visit Beethoven, to play for him in his apartment and have a conversation with him. And Liszt asked Beethoven, what do you think, about the use of the metronome? And Beethoven's comment, according to Liszt, was better not to use it at all. And I think I agree with Beethoven. It certainly has been my experience that the greatest compositions are those which come from the heart. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you to Maestro David Whitwell, as always, illuminating and interesting. So, dear friends of the Major TV, see you for the next episode. And I suggest you to take a look at the book, a new book on Mozart, at the page 89 and 118. You can find all the additional readings about this beautiful discussion of today. So, see you for the next episode in conversation with David Whitwell.